there's like a surprise factor, which to describe this to make it make sense for people would be if I said to you, Patrick, hey, there's a dead body out in the hallway here. You and I have to go deal with this. Your brain has a chance to kind of cycle up, right? So it's like turning on your car and letting it run for a second before slamming on the gas, right? But if you turn on that car and slam on the gas, it's very hard on the engine. So the same factor applies when if you and I just walked out into the hall and we weren't expecting it, and now there's a dead body on the floor, right? Like, so your brain has to go 0 to 60 real fast, and that's hard on the brain. And so that would be something else that we would maybe flag and say, let's just pay attention to how you're feeling now for the next few weeks after something like this.
Hello and welcome to the Off-Grid podcast. I'm your host, Patrick, and today my guest is licensed trauma therapist Tom Sarge, also found at Prepping with Sarge. Tom, thank you for joining me today.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me on. Really excited. I've been looking forward to talking to you today.
Right on, right on. I'm excited to have you here because mental health is an extremely important subject, and as a retired military guy, it's something near and dear to my heart. So I'm looking forward to your insights. I always start off with a really simple, deceptively simple question. I want you to tell us your origin story. Walk us down the path that got you to where you are today. You can go as far back as you want.
Okay.
What planted the seed? What set it all off?
So I grew up I live in South Carolina now, but I grew up in the Northeast, and parents were, we grew up what I would say is middle class. I had a pretty good childhood. I grew up in one of those like suburban 1970s, 90s neighborhoods where, like latchkey generation where we could just kind of go off and do what we wanted. And basically me and the other guys in the neighborhood, we went into the woods and played survival games, and everything from army to cowboys and Indians and building forts and all that kind of stuff. Got into all of that, and then Boy Scouts, of course, was a part of that. My dad was 82nd Airborne, and so he had some survival training in Alaska, some cold weather training. He actually got to train with the Eskimos and taught me a lot of that stuff from when I was really young. Mom grew up, she was pretty poor, and she was really into plants and taught me a little bit about like how to care for plants, and that led to some stuff later on in my life, learning, love for gardening and foraging and plant medicine, things like that. Mental health part of it, I got interested in that pretty young. Psychology class in high school really was a big part of that. I had a great psychology teacher and was really fascinated by the mind and learning about all the different mental health illnesses. So like before I even got to college, a lot of people go into college and they don't really know where they're going to go with that. They'll take a couple of years of general ed requirements. I was one of those guys that like right into college, I was like, no, I want to be a psychology major. Done a lot of work with that over the years. I've worked in public sector, for-profit, nonprofit, government, a little bit of private sector work, and currently I'm working with first responders and veterans. I know I got a little bit of a camera issue there. Sorry, guys.
No worries.
Working with first responders and veterans currently, and I do a lot of consulting for other clinicians and do some trainings for other agencies, things like that, and do some public speaking around all that. I've tried a little bit of everything with regards to mental health stuff. I've worked with people with severe mental health, like schizophrenia, things like that, homeless populations, done a little bit of work with teens. But out of all the things that I've done in my career, I think that what I've done in the last few years, working with the first responders and veterans, has really been so rewarding to be able to dig into how trauma works in the brain, all the little ways that those things can impact our quality of life, in fact, impact your family life, your friendships, your marriage, being able to be a part of giving back that quality of life, helping people, our heroes, really, it's how I look at it, helping our heroes to get their symptoms down so that they can be at a place where things that they've been through in their life, whether it be war and combat trauma or, working as a firefighter, pulling people out of fire, or EMS, doing first aid on a little kid and then the little kid doesn't make it, or police officers being involved in active shooting situations, and then dealing with the aftermath of all that kind of stuff. Being able to work with those people and give them their life back has been extremely rewarding for me. In fact, it's hard for me to see myself doing other aspects of mental health now that I'm in that niche.
I was going to ask, it sounds like a rewarding thing to do, but was there something that drew you to that area to begin with? What's something that drew you to military and first responders?
I mean, I have, of course, I've got military in the family, and I've got a couple of, my uncle was a detective in Boston, and, some other people that are doing some 3-letter agency things that I probably can't disclose. So, yeah. And even before I got specifically niched into that, I had worked with some veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan, hearing their stories. And because I'm not a veteran, I'm not any kind of law enforcement or anything like that, first responder. The hearing their stories and what they've sacrificed for our country, and being able to give relief to how that was impacting them, just hugely rewarding. So I don't know if it was any single thing, maybe a combination of factors. And I'm one of those people that I'm a person of faith as well. So I think that sometimes we're led to where your God needs you to be. And that's a part of the work that I do. I believe that I'm going to use my faith and to be a vessel to help people. They don't have to share the same faith with me, and I don't push that on people or anything like that. That's just my personal beliefs that helps drive the work that I do.
I think you're back with us.
Okay. Shoot, how much of that did you lose?
No, so it's recording yours upstream all the
Okay.
time, so it
Uh,
should we should
we
be
can
able to still use it.
we
We'll
can
just
fix it in post. Okay.
Yeah, we'll just move forward. Well, let's dig into the process a little bit. So there's a lot of misconceptions surrounding mental health. I know certainly my parents growing up, I don't think they gave it the respect that it deserves. It was kind of, hey, just tough it out, suck it up type of thing. I don't know if you've experienced that with any of the patients that you work with, but how do we overcome that misconception?
Definitely is an ongoing issue with that population. I think things are getting better over time. Big factor in that is when you've got people who are in a higher position. If you've got a captain in the fire department, or you've got a staff sergeant in the military, and they're talking to people who are under their command in a way that normalizes mental health and makes it okay to seek treatment. That's probably the biggest factor that helps us, to when you've got somebody that's even a chief, if they're going back and they're saying, hey, listen, you're doing the kind of work that very few people in the world are going to be able to do, and don't expect that this isn't going to have some kind of impact on you. Very likely that it is going to have some kind of impact on you. And so you got to take care of your mental health. We want you to have a good long career. We want you to have a happy marriage. We want you to make it through all this and hopefully get to retirement with having, that same level of mental health and quality of life that you brought in on day one. So that, when you've got people that are in the field that are of positions of authority, and they're normalizing it, that's huge. And that's probably what I've seen make the biggest, difference. A lot of my patients are referrals from patients that I'm currently working with or previously worked with. And so number one, that's like the biggest compliment that you can give a therapist, is to say, hey, go see this person. They did a really good job for me. But number two, it tells us that like people are trying to break down that stigma and make it okay to seek mental health.
All right, I see you blinking again. You're back. So, what are some of the signs somebody could be going through, some symptoms, or maybe something that they're experiencing that might be a strong indicator? Hey, I should really seek some guidance on how to cope with this.
Yeah, so the classic signs that I think a lot of people are aware of is, recurring nightmares that are either of the same theme, that are often work related, or of course we dream in metaphors and symbolism a lot of times too, so it doesn't necessarily have to be work related, but if there's some kind of connection to the work that they're doing, either as a soldier or a first responder. Flashbacks, nightmares. And for people who don't know what flashbacks are, I'll try to give a brief explanation of that. It's flashbacks can be, really, really subtle and mild, like just for a second, something kind of pops in your mind from a scene that you worked or an event that you were at or a battle that you were in. Or it can be like really, really intrusive and immersive where the person actually can lose a sense of where they were in that moment and they feel like they're back in that event. So there's a huge spectrum on that. It's part of what we would call in the field dissociations. And dissociations, in my opinion, having worked in the field for 25 years, in my opinion, I think most people get some dissociations, but most of the time it's very mild and almost unnoticeable, right? So people will just kind of blank out like that and you'll lose them for a second or two, kind of like when a video's skipping or whatever. That's a dissociation. Your mind just kind of like checks out for a second, and that's pretty common. Most of us don't make it through life without a little bit of trauma exposure. Bigger ones, of course, can be pretty dangerous. It can be if a person thinks they're back in a battle or something like that, that can be not a good situation. So those are the two classic symptoms that I think most people would be familiar with. The more subtle stuff can be a little bit harder to pick up on, where you might see a person isolating more than normal. You might see some more agitation at home with a spouse and kids. You might see loss of interest in activities that they used to find enjoyable. You might see more consumption of alcohol or drugs from whatever their baseline was. You could see, shorter temper, things like that, hypervigilance, uh, not wanting to go to certain places or be around certain things that remind them of the event. Those are more subtle signs, and sometimes people will pick up on that first, because if you had a family member who is struggling with this, a lot of times they're going to try to mask the flashbacks. They don't want people to know what's going on. Maybe they're afraid. They might think they're going crazy, or that, if I tell somebody about this, I'm not going to be able to be a police officer anymore. I'm not going to be able to be a soldier anymore, which isn't necessarily true. I have many, many patients who have diagnosable PTSD who are still able to work, but we do want to get those symptoms manageable and under control so that it's not putting you in jeopardy. And it's certainly not, we don't want people to get to the point where these symptoms are so debilitating that it's wrecking their marriage, it's costing them their job, and all these other huge consequences that can happen if it goes untreated.
Sounds like a really tough situation, because if your family's being affected by your mood and maybe you don't even realize what's happening, is there a good way to approach that? And if the person being affected by it isn't aware of what's happening to them, is there a good way to maybe approach them and say, hey, what's up? Like, maybe this needs to be dealt with in a
Yeah.
different way.
Yeah, so the really good fire departments and police departments and EMS crews, when they have a critical incident, and by critical incident, if people don't know what I'm talking about, it would be something significant, right? Like, so some of the ones that would come to mind for me would be a child fatality. That's usually a pretty tough thing for anybody to deal with. For a firefighter or an EMS, doing first aid on somebody that you knew is pretty significant. There's like a surprise factor, which, to describe this to make it make sense for people, would be if I said to you, Patrick, hey, there's a dead body out in the hallway here. You and I have to go deal with this. Your brain has a chance to kind of cycle up, right? So it's like turning on your car and letting it run for a second before slamming on the gas, right? But if you turn on that car and slam on the gas, it's very hard on the engine. So the same factor applies if you and I just walked out into the hall and we weren't expecting it, and now there's a dead body on the floor, right? Like, so your brain has to go 0 to 60 real fast, and that's hard on the brain. And so that would be something else that we would maybe flag and say, let's just pay attention to how you're feeling now for the next few weeks after something like this. So there's a couple other ones. Another big one for MS would be if you're working on somebody and you're trying to keep that person alive, and you're literally watching the life fade out of them. That's a big one too. In fact, I tell my first responders, if you're working on somebody and you have a feeling they're not going to make it, please don't look in their eyes, because that's one of those things that kind of gets stuck in people's heads, is that look in someone's eyes in their last few seconds. You don't need to see that. So if you're the best people who probably can spot this is, first of all, is the other people who work with you in these circumstances. And so, you're the great fire departments, the great police departments, the great EMS teams that are doing this. When they have a critical incident, somebody's checking in with the people involved in that incident afterwards, and just, hey, how are you doing? It's normal to feel sad. It's normal to feel angry after this. Do you want to talk about it? And honestly, if you can get somebody talking about it soon after, that will help mitigate some of the damage. That's something everybody can do if the
I
person's willing to
that
do it.
That's interesting because I hear conflicting things about that. Like I hear some people say, "Hey, the more you talk, the more you're just going to drag it up and make it fresh, like picking off a scab on a wound." And some people are like, "Hey, the more you talk and get your feelings out, the more you'll be able to cope with it." Can you shed some light on that? Like which approach is the best way to deal with that?
I'm going to speak in generalizations here, but generally, and let me just jump back to that last question for a second. The other group besides your peers would be family members, right? So if you're out there and you're a soldier and you're a first responder, and your family members are saying, "Are you okay?" Just noticing you're acting a little bit different, maybe pay attention to that, right? Like, because you're right. By looking in the mirror, you might not notice what's happening, but if two or three people around you are saying, "Are you okay? You've been really irritable lately," that might be something to pay attention to. So, as far as talking about an incident afterwards, it's human nature after something bad happens to not want to think about it, to not want to talk about it. So we have this tendency we want to like compartmentalize it into this little box and then throw it to the back of the brain and say, never going to think about that again. And first responders and soldiers get really good at this. It's sometimes it's necessary, sometimes it's a coping skill, because you can't, you're going to go on to the next call, or if you're in battle, you got to go on to the next thing. You can't necessarily think about what just happened because it's going to interfere with your ability to perform. So sometimes we have to do that. Sometimes we have to compartmentalize. Generally speaking, we are going to get some benefit from talking through it, even though nobody wants to do that, right? And so it's a process called desensitization. And whatever modality of trauma treatment a therapist is doing, and there's numerous different ways to treat trauma, they all seem to involve some common components, and one of which is talking through it and trying to desensitize to it, right? So if you think about, and I'm not asking you to do this right now, but if you're listening to this, if you think about one of the worst moments in your life, and somebody comes along, and maybe even it's a stranger like me, and says, "Well, I want you to tell me about it," of course you're not going to want to talk about it, right? But the more that you do so, the less that event, I mean, there's more to it. I'm simplifying this, but it's part of it. The more you talk about it, the less that event has that ability to intrude on you, to impact your sleep, and cause things like flashbacks and nightmares, and to have that, anxiety when you think about that event, that goes down the more that we can kind of work our way through it. So a metaphor that I use with my patients is, at some point I can teach you some coping skills, and I can teach you how to deal with the anxiety, and I can teach you some skills for mitigating the effects of the nightmares and flashbacks. But at some point, if you really want to get some results out of this, we're going to have to go into that dark cave, and we're going to have to fight that monster together. But I'm going to be there with you, and I'm really good at fighting demons. So you're not going to have to walk that walk alone, and I'm not going to push you into the cave until you feel like you're ready.
So you're like a qualified demon slayer. I like
I
that.
am a qualified demon slayer, and I'm really good at it. Demons are afraid of me.
Nice. Well, now I'm curious, when you listen to people talk about these types of things, does that affect you on any level? Like who gives therapy to the therapist?
Sometimes we do go see therapists of ourselves. That's certainly encouraged. There are things that that's called vicarious traumatization, which is what you're talking about. It is very important in the field that I work in to be mindful of practicing your own self-care, knowing your own limitations, being mindful of what your baseline is for, like, how much beer and wine are you drinking, right? And if you're drinking more, like why are you drinking more than you usually do? Or if you're skipping out on these outings with your friendships, what's going on, right? So same kind of thing. I can tell you that I can't speak for every therapist. I can tell you that talking to me about your trauma, no matter how gory or horrific it is, has never caused me to have a nightmare or flashback. Do I get nightmares? Yes. It's my own crap. It's not your crap. It's my crap, right? Have I had flashbacks? Yes, I know what they are. And actually, I consider that experience helpful for me so that I can understand what's going on for somebody else who's having that experience, right? So if we all have limitations though, and if there's somebody who's a therapist and they can't hear stories about child abuse, for example, right? Then that's probably not a good idea for them to take that on as their niche, right? So they maybe shouldn't be working in a program or a facility that's going to be the primary focus of that. So, and that's okay. That's okay. Cause like there's so many different needs within mental health that if somebody can't or doesn't want to work with kids who've been abused, there's other things that they can do. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. And now I'm wondering about the patient themselves because some people are just naturally antisocial and they don't hang out with people that much. You know, they're kind of isolationist to begin with, and whether that's because of what they experience or just who they evolved into over time, that's just what they do. Enjoy the solitude. They like being by themselves. For people like that who could be struggling with this, is there something they can do just on their own? You know, if they're just so I'm not doing anything with anyone, if they have that type of personality.
Yeah. And you have to know what the person's baseline is, right? So if somebody doesn't generally socialize a lot, then it would be hard to notice a difference with that aspect of it. As far as what people can do on their own, of course, balancing our self-care, right? Like, so, but if people don't know what I mean by that, I talk about the 3 R's. So you have to manage your responsibilities, your rest, and your recreation. Okay. So your responsibilities is whatever you're doing for work and your household responsibilities and paying bills. Your rest is not just sleep. Your rest is also, could be meditation. It could be listening to music. It could be watching what we would call brain rot television, which I don't have a problem with people watching brain rot television. Sometimes I have to do it to shut off my own brain. But too much, of course, is not a good thing, right? Like, and that can also be brain rot, scrolling on your,
Mm,
could be some people like funny cat videos. I like funny cat videos.
who
Some people
doesn't?
might, yeah, right. Some people might like funny TikTok dance videos. Whatever it is, it doesn't matter. It's just a way for your brain to say, I got to check out for a few minutes. So it's like an active dissociation, if you will. It's like choosing, like, I just need to check out of this world for 10 minutes
Is
or
that the
whatever.
same thing as decompressing?
Yeah, you could think of it that way. I think that's okay. I mean, I think that for some people, passive rest could be going for a walk if you're not working, like walking at a fast pace or whatever it can be. Going outside and looking at your flowers, that could also be a way of rest. Now, the third R being recreation, that's what I would call active recreation. So this is where you not only need to make sure you have time for your family and your wife and or your husband and your kids, but you got to schedule time for yourself too, right? And everybody's need on that is going to be different. Some people might only need 15 minutes a week. I have a high need of personal time. And fortunately, my wife also has a high need for personal time. So it works out great for both of us. And that's however you choose to use it. But the idea is if you're balancing all three of those, you're kind of topping off your battery repeatedly, right? You keep like filling up that battery back up to 100%. So that's important. Managing your sleep. That means going to bed at a reasonable time. It means don't watch, action movies and horror movies right before bed. It means being mindful about how much caffeine you're taking in after a certain time period of day. Means eating well, right? Like, so if you normally are somebody who eats pretty well, then all of a sudden you're like tearing up the Cheetos and Oreos, that's another way that we are trying to get that dopamine hit when it's depleted. Not healthy, but we all are vulnerable to that, and me too. Food is love. So we have to be mindful of all that stuff, and unfortunately, the things that do give us the long-term dopamine production are usually the hardest things. It's exercise, it's eating well, it's making yourself go to bed at the same time every night. The things that nobody wants to do is the stuff that in the long run is going to give you the biggest bang.
Is it all about just seeking that dopamine fix somehow? Is that really what we're doing? Like we're looking for shortcuts to get there? Is that what's happening?
It's a huge part. It's a huge motivator for humans. It's huge. Actually, there's a good book I'll recommend for the audience here called I think it's called Dopamine Nation. And I'm gonna sidebar here for just a second on this,
Do
if
it.
we could. So yes, dopamine, and there's other neurotransmitters. We'd probably talk about dopamine more than, but humans also need a lot of serotonin, and we also need norepinephrine. But dopamine, if you want to think about those as the big three, right? Dopamine's like your happy neurotransmitter. I'm oversimplifying here. Serotonin would be like your I'm content and serene, and norepinephrine would be like I'm excited and got my adrenaline going in a good way, right? So those, if you want to think about it, those are the big three. There's way more than that, but those are the big three that we talk about the most. And humans, we like to think that we're so evolved, and we're choosing our actions, and that we're in charge of our day-to-day choices. But there's a part of the brain that's also making some of those choices, and it likes to feel good. You can go a while, like you can skip your rest, you can skip sleep for one night, and most people are going to be okay. And you could skip your exercise for a week or two, and most people are going to be okay. But eventually your brain gets imbalanced, and it's going to want, now I need dopamine, or I need serotonin, and I need it fast. And I want the biggest, fastest hit of dopamine that I can get. This gets people into trouble because now we're going to go for the Oreos, the Cheetos, the pornography, the overspending on Amazon, cocaine, whatever it is that's people's thing. When your brain is depleted and you're not balancing that well, your brain's going to be like, you haven't given me a good hit of dopamine in 3 weeks. Now we're going to take it, and we're going to, and literally they'll lose control of their actions to some.
That sounds kind of discouraging because I think it's tough when you're in that situation and your brain, it needs that to be mindful that that's what's going on. Like you're having this experience, but it's taking over you to some extent.
Yeah. Yeah, to some extent it is. It's hijacking. Yeah. I mean, most people probably have some awareness that, like, I'm making a bad decision. But if you've ever felt like, okay, so if you've ever overeaten, right? And there's that part of you that says, uh, me eating this whole bag of Cheerios, I mean, of Oreos, is a bad decision, but I don't care. I'm way past the point of caring at this point, right? Like, I think everybody has those moments. And so that's what I mean by hijacking. Like, you still have some awareness and you still have a choice that you can make, but now it's being kind of overridden and overpowered by this urge to feel bad.
It takes a lot of strength to stand up to that. Are there? I know we're kind of getting away from the trauma stuff, but I mean, if your coping mechanism is alcohol or some sort of drug, and you're feeling this overwhelming desire, like man, I just thinking about a sip of booze or something, right? Just thinking about it just makes you feel happier. Like how do you stand up to that? Like do you have any techniques that you can share?
Yeah, and I'll give you a real world example that happened to me this morning. So I'm currently on a keto cycle, and I'm about 5 weeks in, and I've done this many times, and keto works really well for me. But about 5 weeks in is when I start noticing, like, if I see a picture of a bowl of pasta or a potato or a dessert, like on TV, like, it is really starts getting hard to get that out of my head. So the example today was, I saw something with donuts in it, right? And I just started talking to Mrs. Sarge about, like, because we do a yearly trip down to Disney, and I said, is there like a gourmet donut? And then next thing you know, we're watching a YouTube video, right? And it's about this place down in Disney Springs called Glazed or something like that. And I'm just watching it, and now I'm like, oh man, when can we get back to Disney, right? Like, so my brain's already making choices that are probably not the best decision when I'm trying to be mindful of my weight. So proactive, is huge. Like, staying on top of it and knowing that, okay, now I'm starting to crave carbs and sweets. So what am I going to do to make sure that I'm ahead of that urge? So there are things you can eat within keto that are sweet, and I'll have to like tweak some of that stuff into my diet, or eventually what will happen is that urge will become so overpowering that I'll probably break my diet.
Mhm. I think that happens to a lot of people, and they don't even realize. I think that's like one of the biggest frustrating things about like the food diet sort of thing, is you cave a little bit and now you think you just ruined everything.
Absolutely. So yeah, I mean, proactive, being mindful of what your body needs, being mindful of those 3 R's, managing that stuff. If Can I jump back to the trauma stuff? You got me?
Hello?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Okay. Do you care if I jump back to the trauma stuff?
No, let's go back to the trauma stuff because you know, uh I'd like to explore like some of these techniques that people can arm themselves with, before maybe they can't get in to see someone right away. Maybe it's like an urgent care sort of situation. I don't know if that's the direction you were thinking of going. Uh,
Yeah, that's where I was headed with it.
okay.
So yeah, so in addition to the self care, the big piece, and this is really when you're working with a therapist, they're going after, if you're doing trauma work specifically, they're going after what was your cognitive stuck point in or right after that trauma. Okay, so I need to kind of explain this a little bit. So I'm going to use a made up example here. If I had a firefighter who got called to a fire and they went into that fire and they ended up pulling out a burned body. And I'm sorry for the audience. I hope this doesn't trigger anybody, but I have to use an example to make this make sense. So they end up pulling out this huge, this burned body, and it's a little girl. And maybe this firefighter has a little girl same age at home. And so part of what causes a trauma to get sticky, right? Kind of a slang term we would use to have it get sticky is if we're connecting to it and making it, somehow it's like there's a personal connection to it. That's one of the reasons why trauma sometimes gets sticky. So now this person might be going home and all the other firefighters are having a bad day. Like everybody's sad about what happened, but it's hitting him a little bit harder, right? And so as the therapist, while we're working on that and I'm trying to have him process that scene, I'm looking for, and you can train yourself to do this too, and I'll teach a technique for how to do this in just a second. I'm looking for the cognitive stuck point, right? So what do I mean by that? It's the thought that they had during the trauma or like right after the trauma about themselves. Okay. And it may be that this firefighter is thinking, what if we had gotten there 5 minutes earlier or something like that? Right. Or could we have done something different? That's a very common first responder stuck point. And the reality is, no, it doesn't work like that. You respond when the call comes and you use the best skills that you got and use the tools that you got. And sometimes the outcome is going to be bad. And there's nothing that you could have done to change that outcome because you are already using your best decision making. You are already using your best skills, your best resources, and you are already functioning as best as you possibly could in that emergency moment, right? But they're not believing that when they come to see me. So I got to get their brain to buy that cognition with that memory, right? So we're trying to pair the cognition with the memory. And there's techniques we can do that with that, like EMDR, Socratic questioning, and cognitive processing therapy. I know I'm getting a little technical, but the idea that the short version of that is we want to train their brain to kick out that old cognition and attach the new one. Okay. So when that memory comes up, the memory now is we did the best we could. This was a sad day. It was a terrible thing that happened, but we couldn't have prevented it. Okay. If we can do that and I can get your brain to buy into that, there's a high chance that your symptoms are going to drop off the table and maybe completely go away completely. I've had really good results with people with some really severe trauma, sometimes only in one session of, reprocessing it with the new cognition. It just depends on the person. Everybody's brain's a little different. Sometimes it takes a couple months, sometimes it takes a full year. Sometimes it takes a couple years, but some people get it in just that first session. And some of this too, right? It's like they may say, well, I think it's that I was blaming myself. And we target that and we're going after that. And then we find out the symptoms aren't going down. Well, why aren't they going down? Because we found the wrong cognition. The cognition was this made me feel like when I was 7 years old and my friend died in a house fire. We thought we had it, but we didn't have it. It was the wrong cognition, right? So sometimes it's a little tricky finding that that stuck point. So if people don't want to go to therapy and they can't get to therapy, maybe even for some reason, you still want to try to think about, how am I thinking about this event that's bothering me, and how do I change it, right? How do I change this cognition so that every time this comes up in my brain, because it can be triggered without you intending to, smells, sounds, right?
I was gonna say some things that are traumatic, they're it's trauma, and it's gonna be, a memory that you have. It's not like the Men in Black mind eraser thing that you can like flash and poof, it's gone forever. Like there's gonna be like a residual thing there. But you're talking about when these types of thoughts become like so intrusive that it's affecting your everyday life, correct?
Yeah, it's like exactly. So it's like, for those who are Gen Z or older, if you remember, or actually, I'm sorry, I was thinking Gen X and or older, but actually records have come back. So if you think about like when a record skips, right, and it just kind of keeps hitting that same note over and over and over again, that's what's happening with these cognitive stuck points. Is that thought is just kind of keeps coming back, and the brain's trying to heal it. When you have a nightmare or a flashback, your brain is trying to heal it, but it's not getting past that stuck point. So it just kind of keeps looping back to it, looping back to it, looping back to it. And so to push it past that stuck point, we gotta change how we're thinking about it. That's a big component in most of the trauma modalities. That's why it's a recurring nightmares happen. It's a broken record. It just keeps playing over and over and over again until we can get you thinking about that differently. And the brain is now associating a different thought with that memory, right? Does that make sense?
It does. And okay, so it almost sounds like trauma. It's like if lightning struck your house and went down the electricity went through the wire and started fusing things together, and now like that electrical loop is messed up until you can find where it's fused and
Yeah.
like rewire it somehow. Is that actually what's happening, like in like neurologically, on like physically in your brain? Is like a trauma a reaction that rewires you somehow?
Yes and no. Excuse me. Yes and no. I like that you said wiring. That's a great metaphor. We have an expression in the field that neurons that fire together wire together. So yes, and let me backtrack it a little bit to explain it for people. So when you get involved in a emergency situation where it doesn't have to be life or death, but your brain perceives this is life or death, either for you or the people around you. Okay. And now what happens is your part of the brain, the upper part of the brain, which is what makes humans really awesome. This is where art and music and building cities and like everything and going to the moon and landing a robot on Mars, all the cool things that humans have done is up here, right? Back here in the lower part of the brain stem is more like a survival type brain. Okay, it's very primitive. It's very animalistic, if you will. In fact, we call it the lizard brain in the field. It's nicknamed the lizard brain. So it's almost like these two different parts, right? So you got your brain stem and you got your upper brain, and they work together. But when there's an emergency and perceived life or death, this part gets more of the control than this part. Okay, so a lot of this part of the brain says, "Whoop, we need you." Turn the switch, and now your amygdala is getting activated, and you're gonna get a ton of adrenaline, and you're gonna get faster, stronger, more resilient to pain. Your brain processing power gets sped up. So if anybody's ever had that experience, especially for you combat veterans, where you felt like the world was moving in slow motion, what was actually happening is, because time is relative. I don't want to get too far down the physics field, but time is relative. So, which means it's like time's perceived differently for different people. So your brain processing power is now like overclocked. Like you've overclocked the brain to process information really, really fast. The world's not moving in slow motion. Your brain's moving on hyperdrive. And that's why you get that like altered state of consciousness that feels like you can see things in slow motion. And, you know, and that's been talked about for thousands of years. Warriors have talked about it in a way like battle zen, and athletes even talk about it too, like being in the zone, right? That's what that is happening there, where they can see things in slow motion. Have you ever seen, if you're an MMA fighter, have you ever seen one of those fighters that can like do a slip, and it's like watching a superhero just like dodge punches? They're just like, and it looks like it's so easy to them. Their brain's overclocking at that moment, and they literally are seeing it in slow motion. Anderson Silva was like one of the people that, like, if you ever watched some of his fights when he was in his prime, like people would be throwing his punches, and it was like watching Spider-Man. You know, he's just like moving away from it. So all that's good, right? Like we need to be faster, stronger, more resilient in those situations. But what happens is after the emergency is done, your brain stem sends all that stuff, all that data back up to here. And now this is where some stuff starts to happen, because this part of the brain stem, isn't really made for processing memories and sensory input. It does, but its primary focus is keeping you alive and keeping the people around you alive. So it sends all this data up, but it's now your upper brain says, well, this is like a puzzle that's just been dumped out on the table.
Mm.
What do we do with this? Okay, so let's try to start putting this away. Let's see. Blood smells like copper. Let's put this in this file. Gunshots sound like fireworks. Let's put that in this file over here, right? So we've got like all these little puzzle pieces now, all scattered around your neural engrams. And this is why they can get so easily activated. You hear fireworks, and all of a sudden you're back in Iraq, you know, or you smell copper, and all of a sudden you're remembering that person that you watched bleed out, you know. So yes, neurons that fire together wire together, and yes, there is. The good news is there's plasticity to the brain, and for a long time it was thought of that like brain things that happen in the brain were permanent, and specifically, you know, traumatic brain injuries and things like that. Well, we're becoming more and more flexible on that thought process, that there is plasticity in the brain, and we can learn to do things differently, and we can learn to think differently too. So that's what I'm doing as a therapist, is I'm trying to get you to take that memory of when you pulled that little girl out of the fire, and I'm trying to give you a new cognition to attach to it. You're right when you say it's always a part of you. That story, I can't make it go away. I wish that I could. If I could take that pain from people, I would. I can't do that. All I can do is make you think differently about it.
Are there techniques out there that people can go through themselves physically to bring them back to reality if they experience a memory that's really triggering like that?
Yeah, definitely. So a couple things people can do. So you talking about like a flashback or dissociation?
Yeah, you know,
Yeah.
if it hits you really strong and, you know, all of a sudden, you know, the rug's pulled out from under you and, you know,
Now
this is
you're in a firefight somewhere or
a tough
something.
situation. Yeah.
Yeah. So absolutely. So the first technique I usually teach people is called sensory grounding. And what you do is you have to recognize as soon as it starts, which, as somebody who's had flashbacks, I understand, like there is even a part of you, even if it's unpleasant, that wants to follow that trail, right? It's like a breadcrumb. And now you're like, why am I seeing this? What's happening? And you kind of want to follow the breadcrumb trail. But what you really need to do is, as soon as it starts, start looking around where you are, and you want to try to pick up what are 5 things that you see in the room, right? So 5 things that I see. So I might look around my room and I might say, okay, I see my lamps, I see the computer, I see my water bottle, I see my phone, I see one of my knives over there. Okay. 4 things that I hear. Now that one can be hard, but you have to quiet your mind for a second, and maybe you hear traffic outside, or maybe you hear somebody in the next room, or you hear the television nearby or whatever, but just birds singing outside. Try to get a couple things there. If you don't get 4, don't worry about it. You move on to the next thing. So the next thing is 3 things that I physically feel, not emotionally, physically feel. Because emotions, again, is one of those things that can have its own little neural engram up in the brain that can, you know, kind of light us up basically. So physically feel. So I always say that one of those should be an anchor for you. So if you've ever seen the movie Inception, you know, they had the anchor that was like how they could tell what reality was. So for me, I use my wedding band. That's my anchor. If I can feel that on my finger, I know exactly where I am. It's not a dream, right? In your dream, Little things like that, your brain has a hard time processing small details in dreams. And same with flashbacks too. So I might say my wedding band, I can feel the chair underneath me and I can feel my feet on the floor. Okay. So then the next thing is going to be two things that you smell. And this might be hard for somebody. Maybe there's not a lot around you, but I always say if I can quiet my mind for a second, I can smell my soap and I can smell the laundry detergent on me. Just have to think about it. And then one thing you taste. Right now, the only thing I taste is my water because I've been sipping on my water. So what that does now is that's called sensory grounding. What it does is your brain can't sustain both images. It can't be in the presence of the flashback and be in the mindfulness of the moment. It has to choose, and so you're forcing it to choose this. You're forcing it to, no, I am here in my recording studio and I'm talking to Patrick, and it is mid-February, and I know what I'm going to be watching on TV tonight with Mrs. Sarge. You're just making yourself be present. So that one's huge. It's a good. It's not going to cure, but it's first aid. It will break you out of the moment if you choose to. And I always tell my patients, if you choose to think about that event later on because you want to kind of process through it, that's okay. But I want you to be in charge of that, that video, that movie that you've got in your head. You have to be deciding when and where that happens, not that your subconscious is forcing it on you. So you gotta recognize when it's happening and don't follow that breadcrumb. You gotta break yourself out of it as quick as you can. So that will go a long way towards, stopping them in their tracks. And another technique that I just learned recently, and I can't really explain how this works in the brain because I don't know enough about it, but I learned this from another therapist, is you're going to hold your finger out at arm's length and try to focus on the tip of your finger and then the farthest point in the room, and hold that for a second, then back to your finger and then the tip of your finger, then back to your farthest point in the room, and do that about 6 times back and forth.
Hmm.
And it's like when you are looking through the camera of your phone and it can like focus in and out, right, from near to far.
I was thinking the front sight post of a
Okay.
rifle.
That'll work. I don't know exactly why this works. My understanding it has something to do with like how that ocular muscle connects to the brain, and maybe it connects to the amygdala or something. I'm not sure, because I've just learned about this one myself and have started working on that with my patients and asking them for some feedback.
You mentioned this is kind of like a band-aid, like first aid. Is there mental health first aid? Is that something people can take a class on and like learn about this?
Absolutely. And actually, I encourage everybody in the survival community, everybody in the prepping community, all your off-grid homesteaders, because the whole idea of those communities, bushcraft communities, we strive to be able to use the tools at our disposal and be somewhat self-sufficient and be somewhat independent, right? So there are mental health first aid classes, and that's exactly what people would search in their community. I know a lot of times the churches will do them, or if the people have a mental health center near them, they'll do them periodically. And often they're free, but you will learn things like how to teach somebody how to do diaphragmatic breathing, which is sometimes my combat veterans will say, oh, that's box breathing. It's very similar. Things like if I was working with somebody as a layperson, I wasn't a therapist, let's say, and I knew they just came out of a really bad scene. My goal as a mental health first aid provider would be, I want to get you talking about it as quick as possible so that it's not getting stuck up here. I want you getting it out. Let's talk, let's get it out. And just listen, and you can validate, right? So validate just means I'm going to say things like, so if they say, I can't believe it, that tornado, I felt like I was going to die. So I might just repeat back, it felt like you were about to die, right? That's a type of validation, right? So, and then what happens internally for somebody when you do that, sometimes it comes out physically, but they're going to be like, yes, thank you. You get it. You hear me, right? And it's very good for the brain to get validation. We all want that. So they can do some of that, and they can do things like teaching sensory grounding, which we just talked about. So there's a lot of different techniques, first aid techniques that people can use to help somebody in the aftermath of a big event, a crisis or an emergency. You just look at in the last couple of years what we've had with Hurricane Helene, wildfires in California. We had Hawaii with the fires. We had Palestine, Ohio with the chemical spill, the train derailment, right? You're talking thousands of people who have now had a traumatic event. Not, we need more therapists. So the more people that train in this mental health first aid thing, the more we appreciate it, because you can do a lot of damage mitigation, especially in the beginning. If you get somebody doing some skills and changing how they think in the first few days after an emergency, that will help a lot in preventing long-term problems. And then, of course, part of that is, uh, you're letting somebody know, like, you could have, this was a pretty big thing. You just lost your house to a wildfire. You could have some residual symptoms to this, and these are some places where you might, you know ask for more help if you need it. So you just kind of make that available to people, and give people need information, right? Like, what's the first thing after emergency? You see interviews of people like, I don't know what to do now, right? That's what everybody who's interviewed is like, what do I do now? So you want to give them some resources. Of course, shelter and Maslow's hierarchy of human needs comes into play there, and people need safety and security and shelter above all the other things. Like, you have to take care of that stuff first too.
No, it's interesting that it sounds like some of this stuff might be ingrained in our human nature. A few years back, I experienced a once in a thousand year flood event in our little area that we were living in Upper Michigan. And it cut our neighborhood off from the rest of society for a few days. And I remember the clump of houses we were in, we'd go and we were checking on everybody, and this one lady, her basement completely flooded out. She lost everything that she had, but this one heirloom survived. And she
Mm.
was clutching it, right? And what you said, she's like, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe this happened. I like." What are we going to do now? And, I remember trying to console her and be like, it's okay. We're all here. Right. And like, that in and of itself kind of sounds like a sort of mental first aid, just being there for someone while they're going through whatever they're feeling. It just seems like we're like that's just what we do naturally, I think, if you're just a decent human being.
Yeah. 100%. And I think, yeah, being a good listener, being empathetic, sharing resources when you can. That's one of the things with when I do with my prepping content is there's a niche within the niche where some people will say in the prepping community, if SHTF happens, I'm not telling anybody about my food and first aid supplies because somebody bad might take it from me or whatever. Yes, there's certainly the possibility of that. But you also, if things are that bad, right? Let's say that, our mainland became a war zone, right? And things are that bad. Do you want to lose your humanity in that too? We're going to lose a lot of stuff. Do you want to lose your humanity too, right? So if you're in a place to help people, whether it be listening or helping with first aid or helping with a meal or whatever, that's the kind of person that I want to be. I don't want to survive in an apocalypse where it's everybody for themselves. I would rather be dead than that. That's a hellscape. And I'm a survivor, and I consider myself a survivalist, but there are certain situations that I wouldn't want to live through, and that type of hellscape is one of them. I know that when we've had wars around the world, there are always heroes. There are always good people that are going to do what they can to help other people. We've seen that over and over and over again through history. So yes, there will be bad, Mad Max warlord kind of people in an emergency in a war zone. There's also going to be good people who are trying to do good things and help people. And so, which kind of person do you want to be?
Mm. That's a good point. I'm inclined to agree with you on that. When it comes to resources, you mentioned, exploring your church or your local community or wherever you think might have these types of classes that teach these skills and things like that. Is there anything online that is reputable, like something that people can go to that isn't just some hokey nonsense trying to take your money?
I'm kind of biased, but I have a course that I did that's currently free with Vargold.
Nice.
So maybe we could give people the information for that, and that's all about some of the stuff we were talking about today with how to help people in the aftermath of an emergency. I think that if you Google it, you will find a lot of stuff. There is a lot of helpers out there. There's a lot of great YouTube videos and YouTube content creators in the mental health niche that are putting out tons of free information for people. Well, free, I mean, if you sit through an ad, it helps them out. So, but basically free information. I can recommend a couple good books for people, especially for trauma. The Body Keeps the Score is a good one. What's the one that I just finished? Set Boundaries, Have Peace. That's a good one. I'm trying to remember the full Healing Thyself from Francine Shapiro. I don't know if that's the exact name of it, but if it's either Heal Thyself or Healing Thyself with the Gentle Art of EMDR or something like that. It's from Francine Shapiro. Those are all great books. And some of this stuff like The Body Keeps the Score, people's local libraries probably have that one. That's a huge bestseller about trauma.
Are there any tells that would give away somebody who isn't like a legitimate source?
I mean, yes, for me as a therapist, if talking to somebody and they don't know the lingo, but that's okay, right? If they're still a helper, if they're putting out good information about where people can get help and do things that they can maybe even do on their own, or how to be a good listener, like I don't really necessarily need somebody to have the right credentials for that. If I think when people put out bad information, which is thankfully pretty rare, generally the community calls that out. And if you're like watching a YouTube video and you read a lot of comments that are saying this is really bad information, then it probably is really bad information.
Listen
So
ears.
so
Listen.
yeah, actually, so I'm not going to call out specific people, but there is now that I'm thinking about it, there is sometimes bad information on certain social media platforms, and it's from good intent. I don't think anybody's trying to be intentionally putting out bad information, but sometimes people come on TikTok, and that's where I've seen it the most is on TikTok, and it probably has to do with like how their content's regulated versus say YouTube actually will do a pretty decent job of like vetting people in terms of if like you're putting out there that you're an expert on this and it's not really showing, like they're not going to promote your stuff. It's just nobody's going to see it. TikTok, unfortunately, when I have seen some bad information, like a couple of years ago, there was a lot of bad information coming out about dissociative identity disorder. And the reason I'm not on TikTok, but the reason I picked up on it was people were sharing videos with me of like, is this how this works? And it was way off base of like what dissociative identity disorder is. And I think what happened is you had a couple really popular influencers who probably knew a little bit about that. And they were with good intentions trying to share information about it, but because the power of influencing, like this just got reshared by other people who are copying and then gets watered down, and then you get the telephone game going on. So by the time it gets down to a certain level, it's not accurate at all. And so I did see some of that stuff go on. And I guess, yeah, that is, for the average person, they wouldn't know, right? Like if I'm telling you what dissociative identity disorder is versus somebody else who doesn't really know what they're talking about, the average person, I guess, doesn't really have a way to discern that. You got me back?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I got you.
Yep. All right. Let's see. Where were we talking? So if somebody is exploring mental health or seeking the DIY method of mental health, definitely fact check before you
Yeah,
commit.
yeah, fact check a few sources. That's always a good idea, right? Is to check a few different sources. Don't go on what one person is saying. Like don't, if you're listening to this and we put out a lot of information today about trauma and I believe I'm factually accurate, but by all means check with some other sources. I thought of another example too is so I live in a state where marijuana is illegal, and a lot of most parts of the country actually now it's decriminalized to some extent, either for medical purposes or recreational purposes. A lot of times, and this has been going on for 25 years that I've been in the field, I will see people tell people either like face to face or social media, stop taking your medications. Marijuana will heal you, right?
Mm.
Well, I believe marijuana probably is very helpful for anxiety and sleep. It is not a cure all for everything within the mental health spectrum. So, in fact, for people with a psychotic disorder like schizophrenia, it's actually very detrimental and will make their symptoms worse over time. So stuff like that kind of gets under my skin when I see people do things like that because you don't realize. I mean, I know your intention's probably good, and maybe marijuana has helped you, and I do believe that, but you don't realize that you're probably doing harm to this person who has a psychotic disorder.
Yeah, everybody reacts differently to substances like that.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about psychedelics with related to trauma?
Let's do it.
All right. So
Because
I don't.
there's places like in California that will deliver psychedelic mushrooms to you if you order it. It's becoming like really mainstream.
So let me say first off, my opinions are my own, not representative of anybody that I work with or anything like that, or any of the brands that I work with. I don't specifically do any type of psychedelic therapy with any of my patients. I have patients who have done it, and I've asked them for their feedback on it so that I could share it with other people who are curious on it and have permission to do that. So there does seem to be some benefit to certain psychedelics with helping people with PTSD. The two that I can say there does seem to be some good data coming forward is psilocybin, and which is one type of quote unquote magic mushrooms. There are other types that have different compounds in it, but psilocybin and ketamine. Ketamine actually is, you can, in my state, you can go to a ketamine infusion clinic and have that done with medical staff, and it's done in a very safe location, and you know exactly what you're getting rather than buying it on the internet dark web or buying it from some guy on the street corner. You know exactly what you're getting, and it's done in a very safe, controlled setting. So I can tell you that the people that I've spoke to have had really good results with it. My personal belief is that it also has to do with the same concepts that we were talking about earlier of rewiring the brain, basically opening up new neural pathways to think about things differently. And psychedelics seem to be able to do that for people. So the only thing I always tell people is if you're out there and you're thinking about doing psychedelic therapy, if you're thinking about doing this for treatment of your trauma, I would encourage people to go to a safe clinic with medical staff so you know exactly what you're getting, that it's not tainted down with something else, that if something goes wrong, because it is possible to have a bad experience, if something goes wrong, they can take you out of that really quick and you can be debriefed by somebody who's got training in that area. Okay, so my personal opinion is I think this is a great new frontier in mental health. I think there's a lot of potential for good to be done here. I do worry about people who are trying to do this at home, and especially if they're not getting it from a safe source.
Yeah, and with all the concern around things like fentanyl and things like that, and even drugs that are even stronger, um, that's not something you want to mess around with.
Yeah, you may think you're getting psilocybin or ketamine, but you might be getting rat poison.
Mm.
Well,
Well, I only have two questions left for you. If anybody wants to learn more about prepping with Sarge or follow you on any of the platforms, where can they find you?
so most of my content is going to be on the YouTube channel, Prepping with Sarge. I am also on Instagram with prepping underscore with underscore Sarge. Also on Twitter X, if they search for Prepping with Sarge at I am on YouTube one, they should come up. I should come up there. And I'm on a couple. I pop up in other locations. I've got a little Facebook channel page that's still fairly small, and sometimes guesting on other people's channels and things like that. So if you search Prepping with Sarge, I will come up.
Nice. And my last question, if you could give our audience your ultimate piece of survival wisdom, condense it all down into one little nugget, what would it be?
Definitely don't panic if you, or easier said than done, right? But when you're in an emergency and when you are, that amygdala is getting activated and you start to get that altered state of consciousness where maybe things are moving slow or you feel like your heart's beating really fast or whatever, remember that that's just your body's telling you, we think this is an emergency. We're giving you a chemical, a download basically here to prepare you in case you need it. It will pass, right? So if you're in that state where you feel like my heart's beating really fast and now it's hard to think because everybody's wired a little differently, your fight, flight, freeze, fawn is somewhat embedded in your DNA, and you can train out of it. You can train from being a freeze person to a fight person. That's what police academy does. That's what boot camp does. That's what fire academy does. But that state, when you're in it, is a temporary state. So if you don't function well in that state, just breathe and know that it'll pass and give yourself that chance to make some calm, clear decisions, right? So whether that be lost in the woods or trying to help pull somebody out of tornado rubble or whatever, you might have to move faster there. But if you can think with clarity and don't give in to the panic, you're probably going to make a better decision.
Awesome. Well, Tom, thank you for joining me on here and sharing your wisdom and your experience. It's much appreciated.
I appreciate you, Patrick. Thanks for having me on.